Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me at the back? I see I'm echoing, so I'm guessing that's a yes. It's a real pleasure to be here. I haven't been in Southport since I last spoke at BCVA, which is about 6 years ago now. A fair bit has changed since then. Apart from anything else, I've moved back to the UK, but I'm still really passionate about this topic. Quite honestly, this is something I could still talk about for hours and hours and hours and never draw breath, and which to some extent surprises me because I always thought this topic was going to die down a little bit. We had all the information about carbon footprint beginning, as I say, about 7 or 8 years ago now, and that still keeps going. This isn't something that's going to go away in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. So it really is something that's still continuing to be a focus for, I think, all of us in animal agriculture, whether it's vets, nutritionists, farmers, or anybody else within the animal industry. And just as per 3 years ago, we still think of this S word as a balance between three factors: economic viability, environmental responsibility, and social acceptability. And again, I told you this 6 years ago, and this hasn't changed, although perhaps it has changed. And I'm going to come back to that in about 40 slides' time or so. But what has changed in a positive way is not only do we have to balance these three factors, but now we do it under the auspices of One Health, so planet health, people health, and animal health. So we've got to think about all these interconnecting factors, and obviously that's a charge to all of you within the vet industry. How do we ensure that every system, every farm, every operation balances these three factors, but does it, as I say, under the banner of the One Health type initiative? Now, this really shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, but we are going to see an increase in the global population. Again, that hasn't changed. That's still predicted to increase. And by the year 2050, we're going to have somewhere around 9.5 billion people on the planet. So that's roughly a 25 to 30% increase compared to now. We're going to see the rise of the global so-called middle class, in that people in Africa and India and China are going to have a higher per capita income, and therefore people want more meat, more milk, and more eggs. But what really surprised me, and I saw a similar map to this about 12 months ago now, was that even now there are more people in this circle here than there are on the whole of the rest of the map. And that's only going to get more intense, so more and more and more and more people. But if we look at this quote here, and this is fairly old now, 2008, according to the OIE, 20% of animal protein globally is lost because we don't treat the diseases and the causes that lead to increased morbidity and increased mortality. And in most cases, we do have treatments for those diseases, but they just implemented those treatments aren't available on a global basis. So we do have a fair amount of work to do to feed everybody in 33 years' time now in an eminently sustainable way, using fewer resources to make that safe, affordable animal protein to effectively feed the world. But if we think about this sustainable term, what does the consumer think? And this came from a European survey just a couple of years ago now. When people were asked, these were the terms they tended to come up with. So they're not really thinking about that balance. They're not thinking about the economics and the environmental and the social. They're kind of taking it for granted that food is safe and affordable and available to them. So what they are looking at is food waste, local food, seasonal food, healthy food. We have animal welfare coming down here, cited by 29% of people. We have organic food, interestingly, coming down here, cited by 28% of people. So people have very differing ideas about the concept of what is sustainable food and a sustainable food future. And with all of these things, what we say we want and what we say we'll pay for is not always what we'll actually do. So in this instance, it was some data that came out in 2013 now, and almost 2/3 of people said, yes, we want sustainable food and we are prepared to pay for that food. And that's really great, you know? Again, it does depend on the definition, but it shows that consumers as a whole are thinking about this issue. But as with all of these things, we go into the grocery store saying, yes, I care about issue X, I'm going to buy this type of food. And when we come out, we often see a very different picture. So although nearly 2/3 of people said that they will pay for more sustainable food products, when we actually look at what people do, only 17% of them actually buy them. Now that may be a function of the fact that they can't find or afford the foods that they think of as being sustainable, but also it may simply be that age-old dichotomy between I say I want this, I say I'm going to do this, but in practice, when I buy food, I go for price, taste, brand, affordability almost every time. So I'm going to use quite a lot of examples, both from the popular press and from social media, and in this case, Twitter, just to keep us really up to date and current on what people are thinking about. And I'm on Twitter probably far too much, to be honest with you. I tweet an awful lot, trying to kind of myth bust and bring some science into some of the debates that we see. So these are some screenshots that I took about a month ago now, and I simply searched for dairy carbon. So I didn't search vegan, I didn't search dairy is bad, dairy is scary, meat is murder, you know, so on and so on. I just searched for dairy and carbon. But these were the ones that it came up with. So we have some really quite passionate people, which is absolutely fine. Being passionate about what we eat is really good, but for us as an industry, it leads to a bit of a concern, because it's things like a person driving a Hummer and eating a vegan diet has less of a carbon footprint than a person driving a hybrid and eating meat and dairy. Or we have quotes like here, gentle comment, if you hate climate change, consider going vegan. Now, those of you who've heard me talk before probably know that at a certain amount of time when I was in high school, I was vegan, and I passionately thought this was the way forward, and I totally believed that a vegan diet was really, really good. And by the time I was 16, I was eating bacon as if pigs were going out of fashion, and quite honestly, I haven't looked back. But I will defend anybody's choice of diet every single day, being vegan, vegetarian, flexitarian, locavore, you know, it's absolutely fine. But what I have an issue both as a scientist and particularly as an animal scientist are these type of tweets. There's no background, there's no citations, there's no science there, but they do influence what the consumer thinks every single day. So as I say, we have that balance between economic viability, environmental responsibility, and social acceptability. And today I'm going to concentrate on two of those factors, the environmental factors and the social factors, because those two are the two that I believe are going to really drive us going forward for a sustainable future. So if we look at the actual science, just to put dairy into context here, I'm mostly going to talk about dairy, but the things I talk about in terms of productivity will obviously apply to beef, sheep, goats, etc. as well. So the paper came out from Adam Drunowski at the University of Washington back in 2015. Now it's data from a large European food shopping company. 6,000 products were analysed for their carbon footprint. So we have meat here, we have dairy, grains, sweets, and fruit and veg. Now I should underline these are products, so dairy products. It isn't just liquid milk. So here we've got cheese, we've got butter, we've got ice cream, yogurt, etc. In the meat category, obviously beef, but also pork and ham and lamb and mutton and so on and so on. So in terms of the dairy products as a category whole, they've got a carbon footprint of about 3.6 kilos of carbon per kilo of food. Sweets, on the other hand, are down at 2.6, and if we actually want a very low carbon diet, we can do that very easily, because on the basis of carbon emissions per 100 calories of energy, sweets and syrups are really low. So if all we care about is carbon and having a low carbon diet, the answer is eat a Mars bar. You know? Now, where the trade-offs are then between obesity, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, etc., etc., etc. So it does show that we can't just look at one simple facet. We've got to look at the bigger picture. We can't just say food X has a higher carbon footprint than food Y. We shouldn't eat X, we should eat Y. We've got to look at the bigger implications all the way through. So then if we break it down and we look at liquid milk, data from FAO came out in 2010 now. And again, we see a pattern going across. So we've got North America on the left-hand side, that includes Mexico and Canada, Western Europe, where we are here, and we're coming all the way across to the world as an average, and sub-Saharan Africa right here. And in this instance, and in many other papers as well, we show that as milk yield decreases, coming down from about 9,000 kilos per year down here to about 500 kilos, carbon footprint goes up. So we see a clear influence of productivity and a clear influence of improving milk yield, improving efficiency in terms of bringing down the carbon emissions. Now, as I say, that's just one factor. We're just looking at carbon in this particular instance. But if we look at data for the UK, this is some data that came out from Dairyco back in 2013 now. They looked at about 500 farms, carbon footprinted them, and the mean here was 1.23 kilos of carbon per kilo of 4% fat-corrected milk. So again, that ties in very nicely with the FAO data. Again, there's quite a range. We're going from about 0.8 here to about 2.4, but nowhere near the huge range that we see on a global basis. But it does show that we have room for improvement across the UK industry. Now, what was showed in a subsequent report from Dairyco, which was a really nice one, between 2011 and 2013, we actually see a 9% decrease here in the carbon footprint per, again, kilo of 4% fat-corrected milk. So we have made decreases. Partly, I suspect, because once people know their carbon footprint and know the factors that affect that, they can then take steps to improve efficiency, to improve productivity, to cut carbon. Unfortunately, this data hasn't been continued to be measured as far as I know, so we don't know where we are now in 2017. But again, if we look at the factors that affect it, we see a similar pattern to the FAO data. So the mean each time is in blue. In terms of herd size, mean herd size for the UK at this point was 182 head. Both the top 10% in terms of herd size and the bottom 10% in terms of herd size had a higher mean carbon footprint, than the mean. So we're not seeing an obvious trend in terms of herd size. Bigger herds don't necessarily have a smaller or a larger carbon footprint than the average. In terms of milk sold, again, we see the same pattern. So the mean milk sold, 1.3 million litres, both the top and the bottom have a higher carbon footprint. So again, no obvious trend with milk sold, but where we do again see that pattern is in terms of milk yield per cow. The top 10% here and the bottom 10% here, and here's the mean. So it does seem to tie in, but I really don't want you to go away and say milk yield is the only thing and milk yield is the important thing. It is important, it's a way to benchmark, it's a metric for dairy cow productivity, but what it doesn't do is to show us the full picture, because fairly obviously can breed for yield and yield and yield, but we are going to potentially see some negative trade-offs. And I was at a meeting in Italy just last week talking about productivity, and there was quite a lot of backlash about, but if we breed for yield, what happens to health, what happens to repro, what happens to all of those other key performance indicators that we have in the dairy herd? And that's a very good point. Ultimately, as I say, it's also not just about carbon. So in this instance, if we reduce milk yield, if we have some kind of problem, whether it's disease, whether it's inadequate nutrition, fertility, whatever it might be, that reduces our milk yield per cow, this time on a daily basis, so we got 4.5 kilos less milk per cow per day. If we want to make the same amount of milk, we need 11% more total cattle, cows, heifers, calves, etc., 8% more feed, 11% more water, 7% more land, and we see an 8% increase in the carbon emissions. So that yield impact, either as a function of improving yield to have a decreasing effect on environmental impact, or reducing yield and therefore negatively, i.e. increasing environmental impact, is really important. But again, it's not the only thing. But of course, when we look at these things, cattle, fairly obviously, cost money, feed costs money, water costs money, land costs money. At the moment, we don't have any kind of carbon tax, so producing more carbon per se doesn't have an economic cost associated with that, apart from where we have penalties in some dairy assurance type schemes. But what is clear is that if we increase resource use, because we're not at optimum productivity, optimum efficiency, whatever that might be for that operation, these things have that economic cost. So there is that link between resource use and economic cost. I'm not an economist. That's about as far as I'm going to go into the economics, except to say, as I say, if we increase resource use, we increase the economic cost as well. But any of these things, whether it's not feeding the cows right, whether we have infertile cattle, whether they don't get into calf fast enough, long dry period, long calving interval, late age at first calving, if we waste feed, if we have poor pasture management, anywhere in the system where we have some inefficiency, we're going to have that impact both on the economic cost and the environmental impact. And David Barrett and I will be talking about this later on in our talk this afternoon in our workshop, going into it in a little bit more detail. So my challenge to you is, when you go out on farm to deal with a DA or a C-section or to PD those cows, think about it as a system. Look at where the weak links are. Don't just treat that specific disease or issue that you've been called out for, but where in the whole system could the farmer make changes to improve productivity? It's not about every single cow giving us 35 litres of milk every single day. It's where on that operation are the losses and how can they improve so that their system is the most productive that it can be, given the market, given the resources, given the labour available, and so on. There really is no one-size-fits-all. So if we think about efficiency, this is a combination of data from a paper from Claire Wathies that came out in 2008, but also the latest data from NMR herd recording data. And it really kind of frightened me, because on average, out of every 100 dairy heifers that are born, only 81 of them calve in the herd. So somewhere between birth and calving, we've lost 19 heifers. And when we go out to 100 days postpartum, we lose another 4. So at 100 days postpartum, we've only got 77% of the heifers that we began with. Now, fairly obviously, some will die, some won't get into calf, some will go for beef anyway. But if we knew which ones, and if we knew that we were going to lose 23% of them, we could divert them into beef in a far more efficient way than going, you know, she's going to have to go for beef because she's now at 18 months, 20 months, 24 months, and she isn't even pregnant yet. So we've got to have a more targeted system. We've got to look at the inefficiencies all the way through. And again, given that the average heifer requires over 6,000 kilos of feed dry matter to rear her from birth to calving, that's a significant resource input, but a significant economic cost as well. So again, we see these costs being lost if we're simply diverting heifers into beef that weren't going into beef in the first place, weren't aimed to go into beef. And obviously that has a knock-on effect in terms of rate of genetic gain, replacements, total milk sold, etc. Now, what really surprised me, I was talking to a friend from the University of Bristol a couple of months ago. They'd sent some vet students, some fourth-year vet students, out onto a farm to benchmark, and again, to kind of analyse the areas where that farmer could improve. And they had a 40-month age at first calving. And quite frankly, I thought that was unbelievable. But then I saw Neil Easton's really nice talk yesterday on age at first calving. And yes, there are people who have a 22-month age at first calving and 23-month, 24-month. The latest data from NMR recorded hers is 26.4 months. But if the average is 26.4 and we have some people down at 22, that does mean that we have some at 30 and 31 and 36 and 40. So on this farm that was down in the Somerset area, calving at 40 months of age, that's an extra 16 months of maintaining that heifer before she has a calf. And because she's maintained at a higher body weight over that time, her total feed almost doubles. Because as I showed earlier, it takes just over 6,000 kilos of feed dry matter to raise a heifer to 24 months. To 40 months, 12,000. Yes, so we're doubling the inputs just to get the heifer pregnant. And obviously then, no matter what she does, in terms of milk produced per day of a productive life, that's going to go way down compared to the more efficient, more productive system. Again, that link here between total feed to get her to calving and total economic impact again. The problem is, to some extent, that the economics are not a justification to the consumer. And we simply cannot say it's okay to knock bull calves on the head because I will only get £5 for them, or £10 or £20, you know. I saw I had a tweet sent to me yesterday where an activist group had claimed that farmers routinely induce their calves and then kill the calves simply to get the cows into the herd for milking. And in this instance, it was a picture that appeared to be a pile of Jersey calves. I suspect what had actually happened was those Jersey calves had been born, but had been euthanized early because there wasn't a market for them. And we can't explain that in any positive way to the consumer. There is no way to say, if we have a bull calf born that doesn't make economic sense for the farmer to rear, we're just going to put it down within an hour, 2 hours, 24 hours. We can't justify that. And not surprisingly, publications like the Daily Mail, which is the one I hate more than anything else on the planet, jump all over this and say animal agriculture is bad. You know, the Daily Mail is almost worse than the activist groups because it's trusted by so many people, which in itself really quite frightens me, if I'm honest. But what I'd never thought about until literally about 2 months ago was every bull calf, or even every heifer calf that dies or does get knocked on the head that would otherwise go into beef rather than into the herd, actually means we need another suckler cow. Because so much of our total beef comes from the dairy herd that if those calves aren't reared for beef, we need another suckler calf every time to produce beef calves instead. Now, there's obviously a very important role for the suckler herd, and I'm absolutely not doing down the suckler herd. But again, if we look at it on a resource use and an environmental impact basis, there's quite a lot of data to say that we should maximize the production of beef from the dairy industry, because we can allocate a certain proportion of the maintenance cost, the resources, the land, the greenhouse gases to dairy as well as beef. So if we have to have that extra suckler cow, obviously she makes milk to feed the calf, but that's all she gives us ultimately. She's beef, leather, and byproducts. And to support that suckler cow over a year, we need almost 4,000 kilos of feed dry matter. We need over 20,000 litres of water. And in terms of her carbon footprint, that's nearly 2,500 kilos of carbon. So that's a significant environmental cost that we're effectively putting into place every time we don't rear a dairy calf because it doesn't make economic sense for that farmer to do so. So the activist groups are clever, and I saw this picture and I couldn't resist it because, you know, it doesn't really make any claims. There's no data, there's no facts there. To be honest, if we all had to harvest milk in the way that a calf does, you know, from dairy cows, we may go off milk a little bit. I'm sure that my mother would if she had to think about it that way. And we see more and more of these images, more of these pictures. So the activist groups are really, really, really good. And I do fight with activists and vegans and people who don't like animal agriculture on Twitter all the time. I mean, I really, really do. And it tends to bias my outlook just a little bit because I tend to think, you know, everybody's against the animal ag industry. Again, as an ex-vegan, there is a place for every diet and every person. What I don't believe there's a place for is trying to influence other people's diets or food choices by making them feel bad about them. But again, if we actually look at the numbers, yes, we have seen a 261% increase in the number of vegans in the UK over the last 10 years. So we've gone from 150,000 here to 542,000. But that's still less than 1% of the total population being vegan. So, you know, it's still a fairly tiny proportion. But generally, they tend to have a louder voice, they tend to be more vehement, they tend to protest more about what they see as a cruel industry. And obviously, that is what they believe. And everybody is absolutely entitled to believe whatever they like. That's absolutely up to them. But I do sometimes wish we could inject just a little bit more science into it. Now, perhaps on a positive note, although the claims are that we're thinking about being meatless and going vegan and going vegetarian, and to be perfectly honest, a lot of us in the developed world could eat less meat per day with no health impacts, really. We are unlikely to see a mass move to eating considerably less meat unless we're effectively forced to do so via an increase in the economic cost. This was a really nice paper. It just came out last year from a group at Oxford University. They looked on a global basis at taxing different food products according to their global greenhouse gas emissions. So not surprisingly, perhaps the highest tax was applied to beef. A 40% economic tax was predicted to reduce beef consumption, again on a global basis, by 13%. Oils, 25% tax, 9% decrease. Milk, 21% tax, 8% decrease. And they looked at the health impacts as well. And as I say, yes, we absolutely could, on average, eat more fruit and more veg and possibly a little bit less meat and some less oils and fats. You know, that probably wouldn't be a bad thing for many of us in the developed world. But if I come back to the charity that we were raising money for last night, Send a Cow isn't just about sending cows. It's because livestock give people better animal protein, better nutrition, security, cultural status, etc., etc. And this is some data that came out from ILRI just last year. And again, it just underlines that infants globally are not always getting the high quality protein that they need. And we can argue for hours about the relative bioavailability of animal proteins versus plant proteins. But ultimately, if the ideal is here in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia and Southeast Asia, many of the infants between 6 and 18 months aren't getting that high quality protein that they need. And even if we fed all of the infants every single day with the amount of protein that they do need from an animal source up until 2 years or so, it would make a less than a 2% difference to our global consumption of milk and meat and eggs. So I think we have to be a little bit careful, because if we tax foods based on greenhouse gas emissions, particularly given that the greenhouse gas emissions, as I showed with the FAO slide earlier, tend to be higher from the more extensive, less efficient type systems that we see in Africa, for example, India and China, we run the risk of putting animal proteins absolutely out of the reach of those of us in the world who actually need them most, compared to those of us in the more developed world. But there's no doubt that we do have an image problem, and no matter how many pretty pictures we put of Jersey calves that have just been born, they're all cute with their long eyelashes on Twitter and Facebook, you know, we also see these pictures. This one is particularly clever because, of course, it's the back of lots of calf hutches. So to the viewer, this looks barren. They've got this tiny little window. They've got no bedding. They can't see each other. Of course, if you take it from the other side, you see that they've got open areas with wire fencing, they've got straw, they've got water, they've got feed, etc., etc. But to the consumer, again, they see this and go, wow, calves are just kept in millions and millions of tiny little kennels. This is really abhorrent. And we can't blame the consumer for not understanding, because they see these pictures and go, I wouldn't want to live behind bars. I want to be caked in my own waste every single day. People believe what they see, and for good reason, because they don't have experience or knowledge of agriculture or farmers. And I saw this in the shopping centre in Glasgow, and it looks beautiful. You know, it's fresh and original, and they've got less ingredients, and they're reducing their carbon footprint. And if we take a closer look straight on, look at it, it looks lovely. There's this bucolic old barn, you know, and there's a chicken of a fairly rare breed or heritage breed. I would say there's a little bicycle parked next to it. This is an advertisement for them building a KFC. And I mean, KFC is very nice. I haven't been known to indulge in it, particularly if I'm a little bit hungover. It's fabulous, you know. KFC is not necessarily associated with some wonderful bucolic image of the chickens pecking around, eating worms, and then being harvested in a happy, healthy way. You know, so when we promote fast food with these kind of images, unless we can back it up and say, yes, my chicken nugget or my chicken fillet burger comes from this extensive, lovely barn, we erode consumer trust even more because they see, if I go back, they see these images, we try and persuade them that we're actually using these type systems, and the reality, of course, is somewhere in the middle. A modern broiler house is not necessarily the most happy place to be in the world, but it's not completely awful either. But to the consumer, they go, well, this isn't true, so what else are you telling me that's not true? What are you hiding from me? And as an industry, we really need to be more transparent to garner that social acceptability. Again, we come back to Twitter. There was a Proud of Dairy campaign that the NFU put on at the end of August. I happened to be on holiday that week, so I spent an awful lot of time tweeting and an awful lot of time arguing with people again, unfortunately. And this guy actually did ask me some really sensible questions, but also had these kind of claims. And we see them, and I smack my head every time, because it's victims, and it's child abuse, and it's murder, and it's rape, and it's very emotive terms, and terms that are really quite insulting to anybody who has ever been the victim, obviously, of any of these things. And we see this, and we know it's rubbish. You know, we know that we care for our cows every single day, and we are pretty clear, I think, that cows are not quite the same as humans in terms of the way that they think and they understand and they feel. But again, to so many people, you know, this is dairy, babies taken away from their mothers. And of course, the temptation is to try and fight back, but sometimes we're our own worst enemy, because this came out in exactly the same week. Promoted, unfortunately, by Farmer's Guardian, with a caption, "When you get caught trying to sneak off the farm early." And again, you know, yes, it's funny they've got caught, but to anybody who doesn't understand animal agriculture, that calf could well be dead. I mean, its eyes are open, but it could well be dead. Its head looks a bit swollen, it's trapped under the bars, you know, etc., etc. These kind of things really shouldn't be out there. In some senses, we are our own worst enemies when we post these kind of things. That social acceptability straight away goes down. The calf is housed, it's trapped, and obviously farmers don't care. They think it's funny. Consumer perception is absolutely key, and that's what I'm going to spend the last 20 minutes or so talking about. Because yes, I fight with people on Twitter all the time, promoting dairy, promoting beef. And some people say, why do you waste your time? And yes, it is absolutely true. I'm never going to convert a person who thinks that dairy is murder and rape and etc. to someone going, I'm going to go drink a glass of milk, yay dairy. But both they and I have lots of followers who just don't know, who just want to know more facts about food and farming, who just want to understand better. And my hope is that if as an industry we have more constructive dialogue, we give clear answers. We don't name call, we don't swear, we don't become abusive, but we answer people's questions in an honest way. And when there are practices that we aren't happy with, either as vets or as animal scientists, we do say, yes, this happens, and actually I don't think it should happen, and we're taking measures to change that. Because then all the people in the middle who perhaps just don't know quite how they feel about dairy farming or caged hens will hopefully see that we are trying to change things for the better, and that we do care about animal welfare and food safety every single day. Because this quote comes from a friend of mine. She was 35 at the time. She's now, gosh, about 42 or 43, I think, in the States. She is a lawyer. Her husband is an entomologist and a professor at Washington State University. These are educated people. They have the education, they have higher degrees, they have money, and she still says, I don't have the time. I can't read every paper out there. I just want somebody to tell me what to buy and what to feed my family that's safe and good and affordable for me and the animals and the planet. And this is the danger that we face, because we should be the people that people are coming to with questions, and instead we're seeing that people go to all sorts of other sources. So I'm going to talk about how consumers make decisions, particularly about food, and how what we've seen in the lay press and social media over the last couple of months tends to affect that. This was, again, a tweet, and in this instance, it's a journalist and author. She co-wrote a book with Philip Limbury of Compassion in World Farming. She was also, I think, one of the writers on the book about David Cameron, where there were claims made about pigs and drinking clubs and so on. But again, two the average person, she's an authority. She's written a book, and people who have written books still have that authority, and people tend to believe the things that they say. So she's quoted this tweet here about antibiotics and antimicrobial resistance, but she's turned it into squandering antibiotics, grotesque factory farms. And we have such a tendency as people to use bad news bias. We believe bad news far more than we believe good news. That's why I believe the Daily Mail sells every single time, because according to the Daily Mail, everything will give you cancer no matter what it is. You know, we believe the bad news stories. We buy one that says disaster strikes, we're all going to die because of a hurricane, versus the one saying it's a nice day, go out in the sunshine. You know, and they've shown, the social scientists have shown, that we need 5 pieces of positive information out there to overcome every single bit of negative information out there. And unfortunately, as an industry, both as a vet and animal science industry, but also as an ag industry, we're just not getting those positive stories out there. We tend to be reactive, not proactive. And these terms have a really big effect. Factory farm is one I wish could just disappear. You know, it's defined in so many emotive ways by so many different people. It seems to come down to treating animals as if they are not sentient beings. And if that's the definition, I'm proud to say I've never been on a dairy or a beef factory farm, because I've never seen that from any dairy farmer or beef farmer. But this is a map that Compassion World Farming brought out about 3 or 4 months ago now. They don't have data for Merseyside. They do have data for Cheshire here. So apparently Cheshire has over 2.8 million indoor reared livestock confined inside, restricted in their ability to express their natural behaviours. If you go onto their website, they provide more detail about how they calculate that. For pigs and poultry, it's based on permits. For dairy cows, it's based on any holding which has some animals housed inside all year round. So effectively, if on any dairy operation you house your bull all year, you have a factory farm, you know? And apparently the point of this is for consumers to better understand what happens in their local area, and therefore they can take action against these so-called factory farms. But that factory farm term is really, really powerful. And again, as consumers, we're kind of triggered to believe things based on our existing beliefs and preconditions. And this is called confirmation bias. So how we interpret new information, or in this case, new experiences, depends on our pre-existing biases. This paper came out just last year, really nice paper, came out in PLOS ONE from some authors in the States, and they took identical samples of beef jerky. Okay, absolutely the same process, same meat, same flavouring, same drying, absolutely identical. The only difference is they labelled the green ones humane and the yellow ones factory. And across the board, when blind tasted by consumers with no differences apart from factory and humane, consumers rated them lower for appearance, smell, taste, and enjoyment. Simply the presence of that factory word made people think what should be an objective measurement go down, because it fitted in with their preconceived factory farms are bad, therefore this one is less good than this one. So it's a really, really powerful word that can really have some really major implications. And when we're talking about bias, we all have a bias. I have a bias. And we have Brexit, and isn't that fun? And that's going to certainly give us some challenges in the next 2 years or so. And the media, quite honestly, are not really helping. These are from The Guardian. I do like The Guardian, I have to admit. It's got a really good crossword, but it also has a lot of journalists that really seem to hate animal agriculture. Not quite as much as the Daily Mail, but still pretty much up there. And Brexit is going to cause a rise in mega farms. You know, every 150 cow herd will become a 15,000 cow herd overnight. Not only that, but the EU laws protect animal welfare, and the minute we actually leave, we will just throw them all out and we'll do whatever we like with our farm animals, because we as farmers and vets and animal scientists don't care. You know, these are the images that go out to the public every single day. I have not heard one single person say, yay, we're leaving the EU, let's get rid of all of the animal welfare laws. You know, it's absolute rubbish. It's not going to happen. But again, to the consumer, who it is a very polarized issue, obviously, if you already think that Brexit's bad, all of this stuff is going to make you think it's even worse. And again, the activist groups are jumping on this to a certain extent. This is an article about some claims, again, made by Compassionate World Farming. If we leave the EU, if we leave the regulations put in place by the EU, we're going to see a rise in antibiotic use, we're going to see a rise in antimicrobial resistance. Now again, this is a global issue. We're thinking about it very hard over here. There's some great work being done over here, but it's also being thought about globally, particularly in the States. Yes, they use a greater quantity of antibiotics than we do, but they're also cutting that and they're also making strides. So even if, for example, we have higher rates of imports, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to see any consequent differences in terms of AMR, human health, animal health, etc. But because nobody knows what's going to happen with Brexit, it's really easy to lead that into whatever agenda a group or an association is trying to push. Now, on the positive side, European data, again, the majority, and in this case, we've got these two bars here, so 56% either agree or tend to agree that where it's the best treatment, antibiotics should be used for farm animals. So people are not talking about taking them away completely and saying you can't use them. People do understand that if we want good health, good welfare, we do need to use them where appropriate. But again, it comes to how do consumers make decisions? And if I come back again to my friend in the States, they don't have time to research. So this same survey showed that people thought they should be used, but really didn't understand why they were used. A significant proportion of people still thought we used them for growth, a promotion in the EU, which was banned over a decade ago. So the understanding is not the same as thinking things are positive. And again, it leads into here. So bounded rationality is where we see these types of images, and there's lots of data there, there's lots of numbers, there's lots of stats, therefore it gains credibility with the consumer, and they go, well, antibiotics are good to protect health and welfare, but if it's going to do this to my meat, and it's going to lead me to have an infection resistant to all of the antibiotics, and I'm going to die, you know, maybe I don't want them. So we as consumers, and of course we are all consumers, don't have the time, don't have the capacity to research to understand every single issue. So again, these type of infographics go even further in terms of eroding consumer trust. Now, on the positive side, no animal Brexit does not mean an animal welfare exit, and nor does using fewer antibiotics. We've still got to have them in place where appropriate to treat appropriate diseases. But I saw this information came from the Farm Animal Practice at Bristol University. It's been published just this year by David Tistel in Practice. And it showed very clearly and very nicely that between 2010 and 2015, we've got a 91% decrease in the use of high-priority, critically important antibiotics, with, most importantly, no reduction in perceived or actual measures of animal health and animal welfare. So it does not mean if we cut antibiotic use, animal health and welfare goes out of the window. In this case, it actually improved because the farmers were having to concentrate far more on the signs, the symptoms, the pre-treatment, and not using antibiotics to kind of back up after things go wrong. If we have a far greater emphasis on seeing things before they actually happen, as it were, we can see big improvements and cut those critically important antibiotics, which are going to be very important also, obviously, for animal and human health, but also from that social perception, that consumer trust aspect of as well. Now, to come back to Twitter, possibly for the last time now, I think, ideally, of course, when we have questions, either as vets or as animal scientists or just as consumers, we're going to go and ask trusted people, right? And because as people we're a little bit like sheep, we trust the people that we admire. So if I've got a question about vet things, I'm going to ask one of you. If I've got a question about nutrition, I'll ask a nutritionist, and so on and so on. So these boxes in blue are the Twitter followers for various accounts who I would go to for scientific information. So we've got DEFRA, 116,000 followers, BVA 16.9 thousand followers, BCVA 1,000 as of about a month ago. I should point out the BCVA only got their Twitter account 5 months ago when David Barrett and Andrew Cobner started their Land's End to John O'Groats cycle ride. So having 1,000 in 5 months is actually, pretty good. AHDB Dairy at 8.6 thousand, Food Standards Agency 42.5 thousand, Michael Gove 37.8 thousand. I'm impressed that the FSA has more than him. I'm possibly surprised that 37.8 thousand follow him on Twitter, but there we are. As you can see, I should just point out I'm not one of the people who follow Michael Gove. But these are the people that, in theory, we're going to go to when we have questions, when we have concerns. We're going to see their tweets and go, oh, they've posted something about TB, they've posted something about brucellosis. What have they got to say? Unfortunately for us, celebrities have a far higher reach. So Jamie Oliver, 6.8 million. Nigella Lawson, pretty much a friend to the dairy industry. She seems to like cream and ice cream and butter, it's positive, 2.4 million. Paul McCartney, I love the Beatles. Obviously, I'm called Jude. I get Hey Jude all the time. I love the Beatles a little bit less since Paul McCartney's been promoting Meatless Mondays for the past, 10 or 15 years. But again, 3.5 million followers. Leonardo DiCaprio, he's an actor. I'm sure he's a very intelligent man. He tells us to eat less beef or eat no beef. We're cutting down the rainforest, etc., etc. He made a movie about it just last year, 18.4 million. Wayne Rooney, footballer, 16.4 million. Joe Marler, England rugby player. I'll come back to him in just a second. So these people have a far, far, far greater reach. So while it's important to put out scientific data from Food Standards Agency, DEFRA, Michael Gove, etc., etc., we can possibly have a greater reach by getting all these people on side. If you remember back a few years ago, I think the entire of the UK ran out of cranberries because Delia Smith made some cranberry relish or something in the weeks running up to Christmas. If we could just do that with Stilton cheese or beef or something, we would be away. We need to get the chefs, for example, on board. And this is slightly difficult because, of course, they're busy too, and they're also constrained by bounded rationality. So they don't have the time either. They rely on what their researchers tell them as to what to promote in their TV programs. And Jamie Oliver has the Friday Night Feast. And I really want to like Jamie Oliver. I haven't achieved it yet, but I really want to, because I feel like he could be a really positive force for good for our industry. And then I see some of his programs, and I ended up banging my head against the wall, literally. Because he puts up this beautiful picture of beef, and let's face it, it does look really, really good. And in his program, he's talking about a system where they retire cull dairy cows onto grass. And Amy Fawcett yesterday made a really nice talk about beef and underlined the fact that we can finish cull cows on grass to give them that extra bit of fat to get better prices, better yields from them. And that's great. That is a really good thing to do, both from an economic point of view and a meat yield point of view. But in this example, they're grazed for 4 years on pasture before they're slaughtered for beef. A couple of months, 6 months maybe, even 12 months with a little bit of corn over the winter, let's say, but 4 years? I mean, it does tick all the happy, idyllic boxes, and the beef looks amazing, but 4 years. Well, as a data nerd, I had to calculate it. So 4 years, one cull cow eating for 4 years, basically, nearly 20,000 kilos of grass dry matter. You will improve her carcass weight. She'll put on some fat. It's generally going to be intermuscular versus intramuscular, so you'll improve the marbling a little bit, but she's not going to turn it into some perfect, wonderful carcass from something that was perhaps a little bit less good in the first place, Alternatively, let's think about the opportunity cost and the best use of those resources. We can take exactly the same amount of dry matter grass and feed it to 5.15 beef steers. Rear them over roughly the same period, and we get 1,931 kilos of beef carcass weight versus 345. The same resource inputs, a far higher output, and because on average these animals are going to weigh less over their growth period, lower greenhouse gas emissions per day, and over that time, lower water intake, etc., etc. So we can still get premium beef, but we can do it in a far more efficient way than putting a cull cow out onto pasture for 4 years. Unfortunately, this is the one that ticks all the happy clappy boxes. This is the one that promotes productivity, efficiency, economic viability and environmental responsibility. And as I say, we've got to talk to the consumers better, and the reason I showed Joe Marler on the earlier slide was that he did some really fabulous stuff for the dairy industry, and I don't think it was kind of meant to promote the dairy industry per se, but it was picked up really quickly because he recovered apparently from a broken leg in less than 3 weeks. Now, I'm one of the most accident-prone people I've ever met. I've broken both my legs at some point. It doesn't take 3 weeks to mend a broken leg. But he apparently did, and he played in the Six Nations, and he credited that to drinking 2 pints of milk per day. When I look at my friends' kids, when I look at my daughter, my nieces, they're so more focused on sport and fitness than I was when I was at high school. I mean, quite honestly, if I think back, the people who went running when I was in high school were slightly odd, and the people who went to the gym were even more odd, you know. Nowadays, it's a really big thing. Kids who are 13, 14, 15 run every day. They play rugby. They go to the gym. They're the athletes of the future. And if we can really get through to them, drinking milk, eating beef is a really good source of protein. I know that one of my friends' sons, who's 13, is protein obsessed at the moment. It's chicken and it's kale and it's beef and so on. And we can really harness that to help people understand that if you eat higher quality protein, you're going to perform better as an athlete. So if we harness people like this to talk to the consumers of the future, thinking forward to that sustainable food future, we can engender that consumer trust. And you guys are really well placed to do this. This was a survey that came out of Vet Futures in 2015 now. Pharmacists get the highest level of trust, which I guess is good. They give us the drugs that keep us alive. You know, that's probably going to be a positive thing. But vets, look at this, 95% completely or generally trust vets. And that is higher than GPs, higher than dentists. I'd have dentists down here personally, but it's higher than dentists. And it's higher than lawyers. Well, I think I don't need to say anything about that point. But the point is here, you've got huge amounts of trust simply because of the job that you do. You are trusted by consumers. So therefore, you have a huge opportunity, whether it's in person, on Twitter, talking when you pick your kids up at school, to talk about what we do as an industry and say, you know what, we're doing a really good job and we're doing our best to make it better every day. Because we've got to promote that consumer trust. We've got to show that we have shared values. We care about the animals. We care about the planet. We care about our kids and grandkids having safe, affordable food every single day. To think that we don't care, which is shown by those images that I showed earlier, is simply not true. We've got to have realistic images. Having the kind of falling down barn and the bicycle and the heritage breed chicken is very lovely. When it's advertising KFC, people don't believe that the chicken for KFC comes from that system. And so we have that dichotomy that if you lie to me over here, what else are you lying about? We've got to be more clear. Of course, we're all trained to be very technical and go into all the detail. We've got to give clear answers. This is why we do this. This is why we do that. If they have more questions, that's fabulous, but we've got to make it clear and understandable and not bamboozle people with the technicalities of why we do A, B, or C. And we've got to be more transparent. And if there are things that we as animal scientists or vets don't think are right, we've got to stand up for that and we've got to talk back against that. Again, as I say, to promote consumer trust. Because firstly, I showed you this slide, and I said this still holds true, and it does to some extent. You know, we still need to balance the environmental responsibility, the economic viability, and the social acceptability. But having thought about it more over time, it's not quite as simple as that. As per my title, we've got to have a balance between productivity and health. It's not about just breeding cows for improved milk yield per day. We've got to balance productivity and health such that we have healthy animals, good welfare animals, which are also efficient. Higher milk yield, better reproduction, better age at first calving, less days dry, etc., etc. We've got to balance all of those areas where we potentially lose efficiency. If we do that, we get the efficiency, And as I say, we've got a positive correlation between environmental impact in terms of resource use and the economic. So we do see that balance still between the economic viability and the environmental impact. But that now, rather than just balancing, has to be done under the umbrella of social acceptability. This is a picture of my daughter and my nieces taken almost exactly 1 year ago now. They're the consumers of the future. Even now, they're thinking about what they eat. This one's now 7, this one's now 9. They told me recently that my daughter, who in this picture is 2.5, shouldn't be drinking milk because it's not good for her. And you can imagine how that conversation went. It really wasn't pretty. But we've got to do all of this, but ultimately it's got to be under the banner of, is the consumer happy with what we're doing? And if they're not, how do we change their mind, or what do we need to change to make our system okay? Because if we don't have that, we do run the risk of not having a sustainable food supply in 10, 20, 30 years' time, however it's defined. And again, can be any breed, can be any system, can be a feedlot, can be pasture. There are many definitions. There is no one-size-fits-all sustainable system. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much. You've got my email address at the top here. There's a copy of this presentation as a PDF at that link right there. Obviously, I'm on Twitter for probably too much of my life. Also on Instagram, and I haven't blogged for a while, but I do have a blog where I post things that irritate me. Those of you who know me, it should be about every 3.5 seconds, but it's actually less frequent than that. And happy to answer any questions. So we've got about 3 minutes, I think. And again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. So just a reminder with regards to questions, the press are here. You can also have your picture taken. And over to you. It's always that corner.
Thanks for a very thought-provoking presentation. We were talking at breakfast a few years ago. You recommended a book called The Omnivore's Dilemma, which I did duly get and read the first 2/3 of it at least. I just wonder if you've got any more gems that we could indulge in.
That's a really good question, and funnily enough, I know somebody else who bought that exact same book as a consequence of my talk 6 years ago. I won't tell you who it was. I know they still haven't read it, let's put it that way, so maybe that could be an encouragement to that particular person to read the book. Honestly, no, actually. I haven't seen any more books that had quite such an impact, but the extent of the media articles that we see every single day are quite frightening. And I think more attention to the popular press almost now. People are still reading books, but the kind of big rush for having foodie books seems to have died down a little bit. But what we're seeing more and more, particularly in The Guardian actually, is more and more op-eds where it's not entirely clear what qualifications the op-ed person has, but if it's in The Guardian or any other paper, then it's probably true. And they are having a far bigger reach nowadays than the foodie type books. So keep on reading, but perhaps go on to Google News and those type of things more than the books. Having said that, I've read 100 books this year, so I'm feeling, yay books. So don't stop reading books either.
Yeah.
Oh, hi, Philippa. Thanks for a brilliant presentation. I also probably argue or discuss too much on Twitter with vegans, etc. Not a great idea, but also I think within the profession, on a less public forum, it's also becoming polarised between small animal and large animal vets, and it's really interesting that you say how trusted we are as a profession, but probably the small animal vets are more likely to come into contact with the public than potentially we are, and that is a potential problem, and I don't have a solution and I don't really have a question, but it's more of a comment. Yeah, I think that's an area that we might need to look at, maybe in mixed practices where large animal vets do speak to small animal clients, etc., whether there's something that we can do there to promote not hide away from the large animal side and promote it.
That's a really good point. I actually spoke at a meeting for an animal health company in the States about 5 or 6 years ago now, and they had exactly the same issue. They had a huge range of large animal products, vaccines, medicines, so on and so on, and they had a big human side and a companion animal side, and the messages between the two were pretty much non-existent. So they had exactly the same problems there. And perhaps, again, just having better overall education, beginning at the university level, obviously, because almost everybody has that farm animal experience, but continuing that on, you know, just because you're only treating cats or budgies or whatever, doesn't mean that food production, safe food production, shouldn't be still one of your core aims just because you're treating pets, and making that a little bit more clear for the CPD courses and so on and so on. But yeah, it is a big issue, and I don't know a really good way to overcome it, I'm afraid. But yeah, really good point, good comment.
I think there was one more question in the middle. Somebody put their hand up.
Right here. So, Jude, one of the questions that I would have is, how would technology like sex semen be able to create a balance here in, you know, how we were able to take productivity and the health and be able to address that in a way that would be really positive in the future? What are your thoughts around technology and implementing that moving forward, like sex semen?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good comment, and actually that's something we're going to go into in a little bit more detail in the workshop this afternoon. But absolutely, given how much of our UK beef, UK dairy goes into beef, given that the relative lack of appreciation for the Holstein and particularly the Jersey bull calves, if we knew in advance that we want to breed these X amount of cows, if we breed them to female dairy sex semen, so we should get heifers, touch wood, cross fingers, etc., breed everything else to male sexed beef breeds. Again, we can cut some of that wastage. We can almost instantly cut the dairy bulls that aren't necessarily carried on into beef, and we can just, again, have a more efficient, productive system. It is absolutely one of the avenues going forward. Again, to the consumer, they don't really get AI and sex semen, and they're can be a little bit touchy about it, but it's certainly one of the less consumer unfriendly technologies that can have a really positive impact in making us have a more targeted system, both for dairy and for beef, not just in producing more beef cross dairy breed calves for the beef market, but also meeting the specs. And again, at AB Fawcett showed yesterday that 48% of our beef cattle are not meeting the specs. But if we know what they are in the first place, again, we can target them far better to the market and then have that overall beef and dairy combination improvement in productivity, which would be really good. There's one just out there.
Just the one in the middle, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. Oh no, there's more.
David Weaver, Glasgow. What can we learn from Europe? I'm wanting some tips from you.
Gosh.
We're not alone in this. Forget North America. Let's concentrate on Europe and which countries can give us some good ideas. Thank you.
Good question. Yes, I agree. Europe is probably where we're going to have to look to, not only as a market, but for information. I don't have an easy answer for you. I spoke to some very good European researchers in Italy just last week, specifically for methane. And it seems like those in France and Italy and Germany and Spain are doing some really good stuff. I'm afraid I can't necessarily point you to any one group or any sector of it. But if we concentrate perhaps on those 4 countries and seeing what they're doing, because there's certainly a big, even in that particular group, there was quite a lot of negative perception of bigger operations, confined operations, housed operations, so on and so on. And it certainly seems pretty obvious that we're going to have to, I'm afraid, follow the partially grazed or grazed and less perceived to be intensive operation than necessarily the North American type model, certainly in this country. But as to how they are dealing with the consumers, they are facing all the same challenges that we are. And nobody really seems to have a good answer apart from just reaching out more, particularly to the influencers, the bloggers, the chefs, the so on, who have a greater reach than any of us do. But yeah, France, Italy, Spain and Germany seem to have a pretty good handle on it, but they are facing a lot of the same challenges with not a lot of answers, I don't think, yet.
There's definitely one more person straight in front of me. Yeah, it's been putting a hand up for ages.
Hi, thank you, Jude. Really great talk. I'm Andrea from the University of Bristol. I was just wondering, you said like that it is important to have transparency going forward, and I think you're definitely right, and we have to stand up against things that we don't necessarily agree with. But you also pointed out that we are also consumers, and from a personal perspective, when you are out there in the shops, I know from where I work in the dairy industry, and I know what's going on there. And although I support it wholeheartedly, I think everyone can agree that when you're out on farms, there might be that one farm that if you were going to choose to buy a bottle of milk from, you'd maybe not choose that farm, you'd might choose another one. And yet when you're in the supermarket, there isn't necessarily that level of transparency. I know there are welfare standard schemes and things like that. I was just wondering how you thought maybe the wider, if you had any thoughts on how the wider kind of food markets could make themselves more transparent, or if there's anything out there, again, that the kind of supermarkets could do to increase trust further in the food production chains?
That's a really good point, because it is a balance. We have a relatively small percentage of people who will actually go and search for particular foods, particular products, brands. They want grass-fed milk or organic beef and so on and so on. And so many others want information, but when they're in the supermarket with 2 kids and it's 5 o'clock on a Monday, they're going for price and brand. And we bought the Heinz baked beans last week, so therefore we'll buy those again. So it's making the information available without ramming it down people's throats and letting people know where to get it. And if we put it on the labels, there's so much on there as it is, it's just information overload. We almost need, do you remember those QR codes that came out a few years ago? Everybody was encouraged to have a QR reader on their phone. I didn't ever bother, and they seem to have gone away, let's face it. But if there was some easy to scan thing next to it, or even on the packet, which just went click here, or put your phone over this to find out more about what this means. What are the differences between organic, local, antibiotic-free, buzzword, 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 buzzword. Because the retailers have a huge responsibility for education as well, and marketing can sometimes conflict with that responsibility for education, I think. And that, I've been surprised actually globally how many retailers I've talked to that I think understand all about dairy or beef or pork or whatever it might be, and they are quite often just as uninformed as the average person, because they get their information from Twitter and Wikipedia and Google just like everybody else does. So again, we as an industry have an opportunity to educate, and certainly the students coming through now, we're seeing more and more not just going on farm but going into industry or into government or even into retail. And my hope is that if in the future they will also provide for far more information, both for the retailers, but then again that can be passed on to the consumer.
Okay, right, in the interest of time, thank you very much, Jude. That was
Thank
excellent.
you.